Hello, everyone. I'm Alberta, a junior majoring in Peace and Justice Studies. On this 18th day of the government shutdown, I can think of no better time to hear this next speaker present on the U.S. immigration crisis, especially in light of the president's address last night. Professor Sarah Sherman Stokes very recently returned from Tijuana, Mexico, where she worked alongside students and colleagues to provide essential legal assistance to refugees and members of the migrant caravan seeking asylum in the U.S. Here in Boston, she works as the Associate Director of the Immigrants, Rights, and Human Trafficking Program at BU. Her work there includes supervising students who represent newly arrived unaccompanied immigrant children and facing deportation, refugees fleeing human rights abuses, and other vulnerable immigrants in court and administrative proceedings. Professor Sherman Stokes' interest in this work was piqued by her college study abroad experiences in Central America, as well as union organizing work she participated in DC. Her many impressive achievements also include teaching immigration law, speaking nationally on issues pertaining to immigration, asylum, detention, and mental competence in immigration removal proceedings, and being the single mother of 2 young boys. Professor Sherman Stokes has been published in the Washington Post, The Hill, and Hastings Law Journal, among others. We're privileged to have the opportunity to listen to such an expert on this very current issue. I look forward to hearing what Professor Sherman Stokes has to share with us today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to the Albright Institute for having me for the 2nd year in a row. I'm not sure, I might regret it after inviting me back, but I'm going to, and I want to thank Alberta. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, but I do want to leave ample time for your questions. This is such a fast-moving time in immigration. My colleagues have described practicing immigration law in this moment as drinking from a fire hose, and it does indeed often feel that way. So in recognition of that, and because honestly this conversation will be much richer if you're a part of it, I will try to leave time at the end for discussion, and I hope you'll chime in. So as Alberta said, I teach in the Immigrants, Rights, and Human Trafficking Program at Boston University School of Law, which means I teach law students how to be immigration lawyers by being immigration lawyers. We represent clients in court. We visit detained clients in jails across New England. We respond to ongoing immigration crises in real time. In August, we traveled to Arizona to assist with the family separation crisis. And just a few weeks ago, in December, we traveled to Tijuana to provide legal assistance to refugees in the migrant caravan seeking asylum. And on Christmas Eve, we filed an amicus brief in support of the ACLU lawsuit seeking information on Border Patrol agents who abuse immigrant kids in custody. Today, though, I'm here to talk about the latest immigration crisis in which we find ourselves. Thousands of largely Central American families hoping to seek refuge in the United States, and a government that appears hell-bent on not only denying them that lawful right, but demonizing them in the process. This is a crisis, I believe, that is of our own making. It exists not in the vacuum of 2018 or 2019, but as the natural result of legacies of racism and violence across Central America in particular. As is likely to come as a surprise, as unlikely to come as a surprise to many of you in this room, being that you are students of history and politics and foreign policy, the United States has a long history of racism and exploitation, military intervention, and an abdication of responsibility across Central America, and in particular in the so-called Northern Triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Not only have these patterns unfolded on the ground in Central America, but as I will explain, they have been fundamental in the discrimination historically faced by asylum seekers and refugees from the region. Today, as we confront a humanitarian, legal, and moral crisis at the border, I want to talk about the immigration crisis that we have had a significant hand in making, and also to argue why the United States now has an obligation to repair, to make amends by carving out legislative space to specifically protect this class of refugees from violence and harm. But I want to start with a little bit of geopolitical history and a brief history of asylum law. We could and perhaps should go back to the time of colonization, but in the interest of time and of holding your attention, I'm going to start a bit more recently with sort of the emergence or sort of the creation story of modern US asylum law. Following World War II, President Truman issued an executive order admitting 40,000 refugees. Primarily, they were some of the 60 million Europeans who had been driven from their homes during war. Thereafter, the 1948 Displaced Persons Act signaled growing concern for refugees from communist countries, as did subsequent acts, the Refugee Relief Act of 1953 and 1954 and 1957, and the Fair Share Act of 1960. Finally, in 1965, Congress created a preference category explicitly for refugees, though limited to those fleeing the Middle East or communist-controlled countries. You'll start to see a theme here. It was not until the Refugee Act of 1980 that asylum was explicitly made available to nationals fleeing violence in non-communist countries. Indeed, one of the explicit goals of the act was to assure greater equity in the treatment of refugees and to repeal the previous law's discriminatory treatment of refugees and replace it with a definition that no longer only applied to refugees fleeing communism or the Middle East. As Deborah Anker and other scholars have noted, the Refugee Act was, quote, a clear statement of intention on the United States Congress to move away from a refugee and asylum policy which for over 40 years discriminated on the basis of ideology, geography, and national origin. In particular, the act strived to remove the politicized nature of the decision from the executive's purview. Though in theory the 1980 Act brought U.S. law into conformity with international law and norms related to admission of asylum seekers and refugees, the anti-communist legacy of refugee law, as well as other geopolitical factors, have no doubt impacted its application. Soon after the passage of the 1980 Act, migration patterns to the United States shifted dramatically. In 1980, there were 354,000 Central Americans living in the United States. By 1990, that number had more than tripled to over 1 million. By 2015, the number had grown to well over 3 million, with immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the Northern Triangle countries, accounting for almost 90% of the total growth in population since 1980. Which begs the question, why, or from what, or whom, were they fleeing? As many of you probably know, during the 1980s and 1990s, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua sustained devastating civil wars, political unrest, and rampant human rights abuses. Tens of thousands, and as many as 200,000 in Guatemala, were killed across the region. And in El Salvador and Guatemala, the United States was strongly allied with the governments in power, the anti-communist governments in power, pumping millions of dollars into military and paramilitary campaigns, and paramilitary units that committed mass atrocities in the name of fighting communism. Bombing campaigns devastated civilian areas, and military and paramilitary groups swept through indigenous communities in Guatemala, committing disappearances, human rights abuses, and massacres. In Guatemala, a truth commission has blamed the degree of brutality shown during its civil war on the training that military officers received at the US-run School of the Americas. Many of those who survived the violence fled to the United States seeking asylum. It is estimated that between 1981 and 1990, almost 1 million Salvadoran and Guatemalans entered the United States in search of protection and safe haven. Indeed, the Legacy Immigration and Naturalization Service, the then INS, reported a 7-fold increase in Central American asylum requests over one 4-year period in the 1980s, from 7,000 in 1985 to over 50,000 in 1988. In 1982, the ACLU revealed suspected evidence of bias against asylum seekers from Central America. The court found that, in fact, Salvadoran asylum seekers had been coerced into giving up their right to seek asylum. Information about their legal counsel and status had been withheld, and they were placed in solitary confinement without hearings. Further claims of political bias in asylum adjudication were also confirmed. Asylum grant rates for Salvadorans and Guatemalans in 1984 were both under 3%. In stark contrast, the approval rate for Iranians was 60%, 40% for Afghans fleeing the Soviet invasion, and 32% for Poles. This clear disparity in treatment came to a head in 1985 when more than 80 religious and refugee groups brought suit in federal court, challenging patterns of discriminations in asylum cases involving Salvadorans and Guatemalans. That lawsuit, the American Baptist Churches suit, which would later come to be known as the ABC suit, alleged that the government's discriminatory practices violated the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. After a settlement was reached in the case, then Senator Edward M. Kennedy, our senator from Massachusetts, commented, quote, "Too often in recent years, we have tolerated a double standard, under which asylum has been unfairly denied to legitimate refugees for fear of embarrassing friendly but repressive governments." He was surely talking about our neighbors to the south, and unfortunately, the same could be said today. I share this next slide with hesitation and only in context. I am not one to sensationalize gang violence or to show off photographs of young men who have been demonized in this way. So I want to be conscious of what it is that we're doing. These images like these are shared in the media all the time, and I want to talk about what they are and what they mean and the origins of gang violence in Central America. And on the left, you have the Salvadoran police engaging in mano duro tactics, which I'll talk about. So, U.S. foreign policy was a significant driver of migration in the 1980s and 1990s. What we don't have time to get into today is the concurrent war on drugs, which is also surely a factor, and we could spend another several hours unpacking that. Bear with me, I do know that's also a factor here, as well as trade regimes and structural adjustment and all kinds of things like that. We're going to focus on just a couple issues for today. So if U.S. foreign policy was a significant driver in the 80s and 90s, gang violence and domestic violence compel Central Americans to travel north today. And again, the United States bears some responsibility for the origins and escalation of this violence. On the heels of violent civil wars across Central America in the 80s and 90s, as we said, millions of refugees fled north, struggling to make ends meet in poor neighborhoods across the United States. When their parents fled north to escape the devastation wrought by civil war, many children were left behind in the region, cared for by grandparents and other relatives. This exodus led to a generational gap that opened a vacuum ripe for gang recruitment. Social science research confirms that children are more susceptible to gang recruitment in the absence of parental guidance. So as their communities crumbled around them and they faced crises of hunger, unemployment, and the long-term impact of debilitating civil wars, children were often not in a position to resist the allure of gang recruitment, including the financial stability and support a gang was perceived to provide. Originating in the Salvadoran refugee and immigrant communities of Los Angeles in the 1980s, Mara Salvatrucha, MS or MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang, or Calle 18, emerged largely in United States jails as immigrant detainees and inmates were confronted and challenged by United States gangs. Then in 1996, Congress passed and President Clinton signed regressive immigration laws that dramatically expanded the list of crimes that would result in mandatory deportation from the United States. The impact on immigrant communities was devastating. More than 67,000 immigrants were deported as a result of criminal convictions. They were deported often back to Central America, often to countries they hadn't been to in years or decades, with no safety net or social support. In the politically and economically fragile post-war region of Central America, gang members wielded significant influence and power. They mobilized young members, they unified their structure and influence. In response, tough on-crime mano duro policies swept the region, and Central American prison populations exploded, further fostering and reifying gang crime and gang culture. In recent months and years, many have tried to escape the gang violence in Central America. Some fleeing forced recruitment as members or as gang member girlfriends, others fleeing harm for having renounced the gang, and still others seeking safety after serving as police informants or testifying against the gang in court. In addition to our role in creating and perpetuating gang violence in the region, the United States and Central American governments have also played a role in enabling patterns of domestic violence and ensuring that abusers in the Northern Triangle face impunity. Following the brutal violence of the wars in Central America, funded in large part by the United States in many cases, many perpetrators of violence were not held accountable, and there were not large-scale disarmament campaigns except in Nicaragua. Experts have argued that the failure to hold perpetrators of wartime violence accountable on a domestic or international stage has played an important role in perpetuating the violence. In its 2001 report, the Commission on Human Rights stated that this failure is one of the most important factors contributing to the persistence of such violations, as well as criminal and social and societal violence. Indeed, the former Attorney General of Guatemala has argued that the traits displayed by domestic abusers in her country, including their sense of power and their presumption that they will never be held accountable for their crimes, is the same attitude held by those who committed war crimes in the past. And moreover, that this has contributed to the creation of a climate of impunity and the message that these types of crimes are not considered to be of any importance either to society or to the state. Despite the horrific violence Central Americans are facing and have faced, and our role in creating the peril they are now fleeing, the current administration and the Department of Justice, among other law enforcement agencies, have taken every opportunity to single out Central American men, women, and children for discrimination in the asylum and protection process, both through public commentary and in the courts, reflecting a deep animus towards Central American migrants and values tinged with both racism and sexism. In their actions and language, these officials have advanced the erroneous idea that these migrants are either criminals, economic opportunists, or both. And in any case, they are in need of deterrence, detention, and deportation, rather than a right to lawfully pursue protection to which they are entitled. While this rhetoric has intensified during the Trump administration, it did not start here. In 2014, in the throes of increased migration from Central America, then Vice President Joe Biden remarked conclusively that, quote, "None of these children or women bringing children will be eligible to remain in the United States," end quote, despite their being legally entitled to an individual screening on the merits of their case. Meanwhile, the Obama administration set up makeshift detention facilities across the southern United States, beginning in Artesia, New Mexico and elsewhere, to process and quickly remove thousands of women and children. At the time, a senior unnamed ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement official, said the goal was to process the immigrants and have them deported, quote, "within 10 to 15 days to send a message back to their home countries that there are consequences for illegal immigration," end quote. What is worse, ignoring our domestic and international legal obligations to evaluate migrants' claims for protection on a case-by-case basis, the Obama administration's message from the top meant that adjudicators down below felt emboldened to deny bona fide claims for relief. In September of 2017, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, speaking to law enforcement here in Massachusetts, pejoratively described Central American children as, quote, "wolves in sheep's clothing." He erroneously suggested that refugee children from the Northern Triangle who flee north to the United States are in fact gang members, all of them, surreptitiously entering our country and feigning fear. In the spring of 2018, President Trump, not to be outdone by his then beleaguered Attorney General, took to regularly referring to Central Americans as animals. Indeed, at a campaign rally for GOP Representative Marsha Blackburn, he invited attendees to participate in a call and response, joyfully inquiring, "What was the name?" To which the crowd gleefully cheered, "Animals." Shortly thereafter, apparently seeking to explain Trump's words and specify that he was only referring to gang members when he spoke this way, the White House Office of Communications issued a 488-word statement that used the contemptuous term animals, a jaw-dropping 10 times to refer to human beings. Then in June 2018, again then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, issued a precedential immigration decision calling out by name Central American migrants who are fleeing specifically domestic violence and gang violence. After discussing violence in Central America generally and suggesting that there was something inherently violent about Central American people, Sessions stated in unequivocal terms that in most cases, quote, "claims by aliens," that's in quotes, "pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetuated by non-governmental actors will not qualify for asylum." This is despite the fact that 11 circuit courts have held that they can. And these are the very cases, of course, that the United States has had a hand in creating. The government's continued discrimination against Central American migrants and refugees has also manifested in other ways. As we now all know, beginning in April 2018, the Trump administration began a zero-tolerance policy aimed at deterring predominantly Central American families seeking safety and refuge at the southern border. The government's zero-tolerance policy included a mandate to criminally prosecute every unauthorized entrant into the United States, an unprecedented exercise of law enforcement authority. The government claimed that a necessary and natural byproduct of this criminal prosecution, which, to be clear, was their choice to pursue and had never been pursued previously, that the natural and necessary byproduct of this prosecution was the separation of children from their parents. During just 6 weeks, in April and May of 2018, more than 2,300 immigrant children were separated from their parents. Following widespread public outrage at this policy, a federal judge in California granted an injunction ordering that the Trump administration end this practice. He ordered that all children be reunited with their parents within 30 days. Notwithstanding the court's order, by July 26th, more than 700 children remained separated from their families. And a number of other, approximately 400 children, their parents were deemed not eligible because they had already been deported. In the midst of this, the government all but abdicated responsibility for further reuniting any unreunited families, saying that it was up to the ACLU to bring these parents and children back together. Then in the fall of 2018, as a migrant caravan of thousands of Central American asylum seekers wound its way north to Mexico, the president's anti-Central American rhetoric intensified. In direct response to these asylum seekers, on November 8th, DHS and DOJ issued an interim final rule foreclosing asylum to any non-citizen who enters the United States not at a port of entry. A presidential proclamation followed the next day. Because both the rule and the proclamation that followed act in direct contravention of a statute passed by Congress saying that you can apply for asylum anywhere. It says it very plainly. You can apply at a port of entry or pretty much anywhere else you'd like to apply. Thankfully, that ban has been challenged and recently blocked in federal court in December. The families impacted by the president's policies, proclamation, and executive order are disproportionately migrants and refugees from Central America. Indeed, Central Americans make up more than 50% of total southwest border apprehensions. I should note, in light of last night's speech by Trump, those apprehensions are not up, they are in fact down. Among unaccompanied minors, Central Americans make up roughly 90% of border apprehensions. This administration has made clear that its policies of detention, family separation, and other attempts at deterrence are specifically directed toward Central American migrants and would-be asylum seekers. One of those migrants and asylum seekers is Brenda, my client, and her son David. This is not actually them, but I can't actually show you their picture. To protect their identity, the story that I want to tell now briefly is something of a composite, some elements of a couple different client stories, but representative not just of family separation and the migrant caravan, but also of the factors that push and pull my clients to migrate to the United States to seek safety. Brenda was born in El Salvador, just outside the capital. When she was 17, she met Jorge at church. At first, their relationship was loving. They were both in school and working part-time. Brenda worked at a U.S. fruit of the loom factory, and Jorge worked as a mechanic. But after Jorge lost his job, things quickly changed. It was hard to find work in their small town, and Jorge's mother and 6 younger siblings depended on Jorge for support. Jorge's father had left the family in the 1990s, driven north both by economic necessity and fear of being recruited in the military during El Salvador's civil war. Jorge soon found himself involved with a local clique of MS-13, making money by selling small amounts of drugs on the street. He also began using drugs and drinking heavily at home. He called Brenda names and became easily jealous of her male coworkers. By 19, Brenda was pregnant with their first child, a boy, David. And soon after David's birth, Jorge grew more and more violent. He hit Brenda with his fists, with a folding chair, and once with the butt of his gun. 2 years later, pregnant with their daughter, Jorge beat Brenda so badly that she lost the baby. Brenda went to the police station, but the officer on duty told her that abuse was, quote, a family problem, and he could not intervene. When their son David was 7 years old, Brenda had had enough. David was also struggling. He couldn't yet read or write, and Brenda suspected that he was disabled, though she did not have the funds to have him evaluated. She left Jorge and relocated to the capital to escape Jorge's abuse and seek support for David. There, living with her sister, Brenda soon started dating a young man she met on the bus to work. Just 6 months after they began seeing each other, he was shot by 3 of Jorge's friends, also gang members. David witnessed the murder, and Brenda feared that no matter where she hid, Jorge would find her. Joining the migrant caravan in the summer of 2018, she and David traveled north to Tijuana, Mexico, or at the border with California. There, other migrants encouraged her to seek asylum. While she was waiting, she lived in a tent city at Benito Juarez. And these are photos that I took recently when we were down in Tijuana. She and David shared a tent here next to the border. What is somewhat difficult to see is that this is the wall, right here. Every morning, she and David would line up to see if their number was going to be called and if they would be allowed to cross that day and seek asylum in the United States. Finally, she was allowed to cross. And when she did, she was charged and convicted of unlawfully entering the United States, and she was held in a jail in Arizona. Her then 9-year-old son, David, still traumatized by the murder of his mother's boyfriend, was transferred by himself to a children's shelter in Chicago. It was only 3 months later that they were finally reunited at Brenda's sister's home in Boston. So this is where Brenda was held, the Eloy Federal Contract Facility. It's run by a private prison company. About 1,400 immigrant detainees are held there on a daily basis, including men and women. These are some paper boats and tic-tac-toe games that we made and played with kids like David who were in custody in Arizona when we were there to provide legal assistance to separated children. We couldn't take pictures inside the facility, obviously. When Brenda and David reunited, their reunion was very difficult. David wouldn't sleep, he was easily anxious, and refused to go to school. He was desperate to always be by his mother's side, lest she be taken away from him again. The story of Brenda, Jorge, and David exemplifies what is at stake in today's immigration climate and crisis. Brenda and David are my clients, and they are currently facing deportation from the United States, and they are not alone. Since 2014, tens of thousands of women and families like Brenda and David have sought asylum in the United States on these or similar bases. The UNHCR interviewed more than 160 women from the Northern Triangle countries in 2015. Their findings? These women reported that they and their children faced extreme levels of violence on a daily basis. 85% of the women interviewed reported living in a neighborhood controlled by gangs or other violent criminal groups. 62% of women reported that they were confronted with dead bodies in their neighborhoods on a daily basis. Moreover, the women interviewed reported prolonged instances of physical, sexual, and psychological domestic violence for which authorities provided no meaningful help. The common denominator in all their stories were that these women, like Brenda, fled to save their lives and the lives of their children. And this was a map put together. There's an organization called the Innovation Law Lab, which has been doing some really cutting-edge work around the immigrant crises of the last several years. And they put together a report on Artesia, New Mexico, which was one of the detention centers created under the Obama administration. And they also put together these 2 maps. And there's a cool tool on the website where you can have the maps sort of overlay each other, but try to imagine it here. As you can see, on this side, you have the number of children fleeing Central America. And the larger and darker the circle, the more kids are fleeing. Here, the darker red the area, the higher the homicide rate. If you overlay the maps, you can absolutely see a correlation, right? These are the reasons that people are leaving. Not by choice, not on a whim, but because they feel like they have no other choice at all. 69% of the women interviewed by UNHCR said that they first attempted to find safety within their home countries, like Brenda, but were unable to, despite fleeing to other cities or going into hiding. And only after they remained in danger at home did they finally flee to the United States. Their decision wasn't reckless, as previous Attorney General Jeff Sessions has suggested, but it was frankly the only rational choice many of them had. Okay, a happier slide. Today, in 2019, we are fortunate, from where I sit, to have a new Congress, perhaps one that might undertake meaningful efforts at immigration reform. or at least we can hope. The recently sworn in 116th Congress, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, represents the most diverse Congress to date, including a record 102 women, the first Native American woman, the first Muslim American woman, as well as congresswomen and men of color from across the United States. And I believe that Congress could act to respond to the particular needs of this class of refugees, to offer a pathway for protection for those fleeing many harms that we have long had a hand in creating. In fact, I think that the long history of discrimination and animus toward Central American migrants requires congressional action to prevent continued bias and asymmetry in asylum applications and ensure protection of these migrants. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that, we'll see. But in the meantime, I imagine that some of you in this room may be wondering if there is anything you can do, because I think you're in this room because you care about these issues, and you're not here to just study them, but also hopefully to act. And that's part of the reason that I tell you a story. Neuropsychologists, everyone from neuropsychologists to people like Brian Stevenson, who is a very sort of well-known death penalty attorney in the American South, have talked about the power of narrative and the power of stories. And we know that stories release oxytocin in the brain, and stories compel people to act. And so I hope that these stories I have told, they're intentional, because I hope they will compel you to act and to do something, to offer your skills in some way to support this work. And I have a couple suggestions if you'll bear with me for one more minute. You guys aren't 3 and 5, but if you were, I would suggest you could do a lemonade stand. So these are my kids that did a lemonade stand this summer to raise money for Raices, which is an organization in Texas that was providing support, unbelievable support, to separated families across the southern border. But I think there's even more that you can do as adults, right, and as college students. First, you can stand up and alongside immigrant communities. If we all show up for immigrant and refugee communities, politicians cannot afford not to fight for good policies. They can't assume that people facing deportation, that asylum seekers at the border, that kids and families from other countries, or people who speak other languages have no allies and consequently do not matter, because we know that they do, and we do, and you do. Second, if you have resources, and I don't just mean money, I mean skills, I mean time, support organizations that support refugees and immigrants. This can be through volunteering. This is how I got my start. When I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do or be. I worked at a bookstore. But I also had studied abroad in Central America, and I had worked as a union organizer, which meant that I spoke Spanish. And so I started volunteering with the Deportation Defense Organization in Washington, D.C. I started going to jail. I spent many a day in southeastern Virginia, far from D.C., working with detained immigrants, and that's where I found my passion. And I decided to go to law school, for better or worse. And just recently, we took students, as I mentioned, down to Arizona, and more recently to Tijuana. There we worked with an organization called Al Otro Lado, which many of you may have heard of. They are in Tijuana, and they are receiving volunteers all the time. You could email them, offer to assist with your time or your talent, remotely or on the ground. They need skills, they need resources, they need human bodies on the ground, they need people who speak languages of all kinds, not just Spanish. When I was there, we worked with asylum seekers from Sierra Leone, from Senegal, from Haiti, from Ethiopia, from Somalia and Eritrea, among many other countries. Immigrants facing deportation do not have the right to an attorney unless they can pay for one, and most cannot. Nationally, only 37% of all immigrants secured legal representation in their deportation cases. Immigrants in detention were the least likely to obtain lawyers. According to a study by the American Immigration Council, those detainees with representation were twice as likely as unrepresented immigrants to receive relief from deportation. So if today or one day you have the means to support organizations that support immigrants, I hope you'll do so. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, and in some ways most easily, in our own discourse and in our advocacy and in our work, we have to be conscious of the ways that we talk about immigrants and immigrant communities. Because we have to dispense with the sort of good versus bad immigrant narrative. It allows people like our president the leeway to categorize immigrants as animals. It allows politicians to trade one group of immigrants for another, to say, as long as you allow DACA recipients to stay, we will spend $5 million on a wall, right? That's the good versus bad immigrant narrative. As students, as allies, as immigrants yourselves, as future educators, lawyers, and policymakers, I hope you will advocate for policies and laws that promote and protect the dignity of all people, policies that work towards protecting everyone in our local and global communities. So on that note, thank you so much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm just going to close with one final slide from our time in Tijuana. This is a child every morning at El Chaparral, which is the port of entry at San Isidro. Migrants gather at 7 a.m. or sometimes before to see whether they will be allowed to cross the border. So it's this group of migrants here. There's a man under this red tent calling numbers, and everybody waits to see if they're going to cross. And it's so early in the morning, and people have been sleeping outside or in tents or under bridges at night. And so they come in their pajamas. And this little boy had a backpack that said, "Keep going." And I'm going to end on that.